Season 7 of the Art of Teaching podcast. I'm Matthew Green and I'm so grateful that you've joined me today for this discussion. It's wonderful to know that there are teachers across the globe that are finding these episodes useful. Please take the time to subscribe, share the episodes and leave some feedback. Today I have the pleasure of sharing with you a discussion that I had with Dr. Tim O'Leary. He is a passionate teacher and a data analyst. He helps teachers and school leaders find narratives within their data. We covered a lot of ground in our discussion, including how to effectively link data to a school's vision, the importance of understanding which metrics you're using and how to capture what matters most, and the power of understanding and using classroom data to drive improvement. I hope that you get as much out of our discussion as I did. Please enjoy. Dr. Tim O'Leary, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
My pleasure. Happy to be here, Matthew.
Whereabouts are you phoning in from?
So I am in a small suburb called Maidstone in Victoria, which most people won't have heard of. It's next to Footscray, so it's in a suburban. We are 8 kilometres from the CBD, so it's probably like the equivalent of, I don't know, Marrickville up in Sydney.
Fantastic, great. And what's the weather like down there today?
It's sunny outside today. It's
awesome.
Sunny but cold.
Rare treat for Melbourne, bit of sunshine.
Yes.
Nice. Quite possibly the most important question for our discussion. What's your coffee order? And I can finally buy your coffee.
So my coffee is an almond latte.
Okay.
It's a bit la-di-da, but
that's okay. There's no judgment here.
Well, as we were talking about before, I'm into my fitness and my health and fitness, and I love a coffee, but an almond latte has less calories. How bad is that?
Fantastic. Is there a book that has made you stop and reconsider things?
You know, the book, it's a book that I did after I did a course, and I did this back in 2020. I did a course on Coursera on self-determination theory, so it's a specialization across 4 sections, and I loved it so much that I went and bought the textbook. I'm not saying you should do that. But, and I'm not saying anyone should do it. I'm just looking for the book. It's called Self-Determination Theory. It's by Ryan and Dici. It's the textbook, and I read the whole textbook, and it kind of didn't blow my mind, but it really put a whole bunch of stuff into context for me about everything. So everything I experienced as a teacher, as a leader, and then I experienced in terms of poor leadership, I suppose, an understanding of this whole idea of motivation, and sort of then for me linking that back to what that means for us as leaders and leaders of learning.
Fantastic. If you could have a dinner party with anybody, obviously your family gets a free seat at the table, but who would be there?
Oh, that's a tough question. The thing is, I kind of get to catch up with my heroes. So I get to have coffee with John Hattie every now and then, and through him I've met people like Jenny Donahoe and Peter DeWitt, and these are kind of for me the big names in sort of educational thinking, at least that come out of the US, and the things that I'm passionate about. But I'm boring. I get to catch up with the people that I want to. I catch up with the friends and mentors in my life that have had an influence. I'm not really.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, if you're privileged enough to get to hang out with your heroes for coffee, that's great.
I mean, I don't know, like I'm going to put that one. I'm going to park that one at the back. I might come back later on.
We can loop back later if we have time.
Yep.
What was your upbringing like, and what are you most grateful for from your parents?
Okay, so I'm probably, I don't know, like middle class family, born in Adelaide, moved to Perth.
Yep.
Spent some time in Perth, came across to Melbourne, and I spent probably the best part of 30, 35 years here now.
Yeah.
And I, in terms of what I'm grateful for my parents, I think it's the opportunity
Yeah.
and the support, I guess, along the way. They looked for ways to, um, give me the opportunities to try different things that I want. And then in terms of support, they were, the whole way through. If I've had to move out and then back into home for illness or for whatever reason, that they've been there, and they were very encouraging. Some might say over encouraging sometimes, but the thing is, it kind of it's been kind of what I needed. And I guess, as I think that we all do, now that I'm a parent, we look at what our parents were and how they were with us, and we look at the bits that we like, and we look at the bits that we go, maybe we didn't like. So they've shown me how to be both in good ways and bad ways. Well, not bad ways, but in ways that I can improve, if that makes sense.
Yeah, fantastic. So take me back to the beginning. Why did you originally get into teaching? How did you get to be where you are today?
So teaching, so for me, and this comes back from a conversation I had with a friend many years ago, and he talked about this idea of career. And the thing is, and he said, the word career has two different meanings. It can mean, the I suppose the vocation or employment path that you're on, but it can also mean to be out of control.
Yeah.
If you're careering down the road, you don't quite know where you're going.
Yeah.
So for me, my career has been a bit of a mix of both. So I went to Melbourne Uni for my undergrad. I studied geomatic engineering, which is the fancy name for land surveying and cartography, and a science degree. And I loved it, met some great friends, really enjoyed what I learned, but it wasn't for me as a career. So when we were finishing up, I attended a graduate expo, whatever it was. And the opportunity arose to go and do some consulting work for PricewaterhouseCoopers. So I actually began my career as a IT analyst, which was, again, really heaps of fun. I like problem solving, like critical thinking. But after 2 years of that, what I realized was I'm working for a big company, help other big companies make money. It didn't really feel as though I was contributing sort of back, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I was just generating money. And I kind of looked at what I wanted to do. Like at that point in time, I was training lots of martial arts, and I wanted to travel and all that sort of stuff. So I kind of, looked at, I suppose what I wanted from a lifestyle perspective, but work. And, when I was thinking back in my time, I really had enjoyed the tutoring I'd done at university, both for, so it's high school students, but also for first, second, and third year university students. Kind of opened up the idea that, maybe teaching was for me. So I applied to get into my, at that point in time, graduate diploma of education, and I got in, and I did my 9-month learning permit to become a teacher. And then, that was back in 2022, and I've been teaching ever since.
Fantastic. And what was your experience at school like? Was there a teacher that had a positive or negative impact in your life?
Yeah, look, I absolutely. I think, we all have those, don't we? If I think back over my life, I can think of, teachers like Mrs. Bellamy, who was my humanities teacher across 3 years. I can think about, some of the maths teachers. I was a maths teacher that really kind of irritated me along the way.
Yeah, I had one of those.
Yeah, well, I am a maths teacher, and I think, and I can say this because I was one, is we can be strange sometimes.
Yeah.
And we certainly love our material, but I think that sometimes we can be a bit old school in terms of the way we think about our jobs.
Yeah, absolutely.
No offense to any maths teachers there.
No, not at all. I mean, I was interviewing Eddie Wu a little while ago, and we're talking about this idea that I hated maths at school. I absolutely hated it, and I'm convinced my teacher hated it as well. But he was still teaching it, and I was told that the answers were in the back of the book and not to look. And I was never really told why we were doing the subject. And it wasn't until I got to university, and there was a professor called Catherine Attard that really changed the game for me. And I thought, where was this subject when I was at high school? And so I think for me, by far, maths is now my favorite subject to teach young kids, and to see them approach it with awe and wonder is really beautiful. And it's actually a really useful subject. Like I said, I don't know why I wasn't made aware of this in high school. But it's actually
there are lots of reasons. I think sometimes, we have negative experiences early on.
Yeah.
And maths is one of those subjects where it truly is incremental, and the way that curriculum is constructed and the way that teaching and learning hangs off that curriculum, it means that once you've missed a I think about maths as like building a brick wall. Once you miss a layer or miss elements of a layer, it makes the next layer much more complicated. And
Yeah.
it's because we march through and we don't take time to, address where students are at along the way. But, there's a whole bunch of pressures
Yeah.
associated with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, obviously, your current work is focused on predominantly data and measurement in schools. And how did you go from being a teacher to deciding to make that career step and moving into more of that space?
Well, it wasn't so much a step, it was always kind of there. So, land surveying and computer programming and data management, it's all about data. It's all
Yeah.
about, collecting, measuring, essentially land surveying is measurement, it's measurement science.
Yeah.
So this idea of, measuring things and tracking things, I guess, has always been compelling. But for me, probably the real pivot began in 2007. You may or may not remember back in, I don't know when it was, 2006, 2007, the federal government at the time offered these, summer schools for teachers. They were trying to get teachers in to do more professional learning. So it only happened once because there was a change in government. But I, along with 200 other maths teachers, attended a conference in Armidale, New South Wales for 10 days, where we got to listen to some of the best, theory and research that was out and about at that point in time. And it was at that conference that I saw, John Hattie speak for the first time. So he got up and he talked about a book that was about to be coming out. And he talked about what he'd seen in that book. And for me, it was like, boom.
Wow.
Like, why aren't we thinking about these things, more broadly?
Yeah.
And that for me was the real pivot. I came back from that going, right, how do I get it wasn't the NAPLAN data at that point in time. How do I get the AIM data? How do I get access to some PAT data? How do I get these things? And how do I conceptual, how do I get access to these things, and how can I begin thinking about how I might do that in the classroom and at my school?
Yeah. So, what are some of the things that you think that schools get wrong with data? Because I think I'm talking from a New South Wales context, and I very proudly went down to Melbourne to do my master's, but my teaching experience is predominantly in New South Wales, and we seem to be pretty obsessed with measuring things. But I mean, you could argue that it's not always effective, but we seem to be always collecting data. What do you think we seem to get wrong?
Well, I mean, there's a few things there. One is, one of the key things for me is it's not about the data, it's what you do with it that matters. So yes, data is important, but I think we have this fixation on getting data, and then looking at it, but that doesn't necessarily lead to actions. It's what happens as a consequence of engaging with the data.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, there's a lot of things, and I've spoken about this a few times this year. I think that we have this challenge that data is seen as a panacea for the woes and the problems that sit within education, and I do not doubt that data can be helpful, but we need to do a better job of linking it in with, say, our school visions and the practices and processes within our schools. I would argue that, at least in the schools I've worked in, there's not a clear connection between the vision and the data that's being looked at. A lot of schools, and I have worked within independent schools for most of my career, have beautiful visions that are full of, what Don Watson calls weasel words. They're not measurable. They're really intangible, and they sound wonderful. The marketers love them. Parents love them. But the thing is, what does it mean, and how can a school hang their hat on it? So NAPLAN often doesn't link to some of these things. I think that we need to have a lot more clarity and transparency in terms of what our goals are and visions and for schools, so that we can then begin to link what the vision is to the way we're using data in the classroom.
Yeah.
Along the way, that means having a vision, understanding what you're measuring for it, understanding what metrics you need to be looking at, understanding what your baseline is. Now, we haven't even got to teachers using data yet. Once you know what your baseline is, identifying what you need to focus on. And once you've decided to focus on, then going, right, what initiatives do we need to put into place? I think that often we leap to initiatives first. We don't get to the, we don't spend enough time thinking about the why of data. So, we have the AITSL professional teaching standards. We've got, the ACR's or National School Tool for School Improvement, and they all reference data, and they talk about, literacy and numeracy data. So, by stealth, they're talking about NAPLAN or the ACR PAT testing, or, they're talking about well-being, which, now that we've had the pandemic, is this plethora of, pulse checkers that are out there. But they also, I think, don't sort of privilege a lot of the data that teachers are already using and already have access to in the classroom. I think that there is, when we talk data, we think NAPLAN. We don't think about the formative assessment data and responsive teaching data that we're interacting with every day. We don't think the observational data. As our kids walk into the class and we're looking at their body language, we're not thinking about the mini whiteboards that we're using. So I think that there is this perception reality gap when it comes to data.
So do you think that in schools our curriculum is kind of over prescribed, and do you think that teachers, there needs to be a little bit more trust for teachers to be able to do their jobs?
Well, I guess that's a double-edged sword, really, isn't it? I think that to do our jobs properly, there's too much curriculum.
Yeah.
And there does need to be a lot more autonomy for schools to meet the needs of the students that they're working with. But that's really easy to say. But on the flip side, I don't think it hurts to have something aspirational that we're all looking to achieve. Like, I'm reading a book at the moment on, a particular methodology that's talking about, I suppose setting appropriately high standards for all students so that they can all hit grade level effectively. So it's a book out of the US. And I think it's really important to have high expectations for students. But coming out of Melbourne Uni and having done work with Patrick Griffin, I also like to be pragmatic about that and sit down and go, well, if we know that we have a 6-year spread for the students in our class, and we're teaching a year 9 cohort of maths students, and we know some of them are already beyond this curriculum and some of them are so far behind that they've got almost no chance of catching up, I still don't think it's sufficient to just set appropriately high standards at grade level. We need to be setting appropriately high standards in terms of the growth those children are going to experience, if that makes sense. Now, I'm not answering your question. I've segued there. But I think that, I think alongside the fact that there needs to be greater autonomy for teachers, and I think that there needs to be greater capacity built in terms of some things, because, teaching is a profession with a diverse range of, with practitioners with a diverse range of experience, and what we know about education has changed, and what we know about education and what works in education has changed. So I think that sometimes we need to spend time, recapacity building some of the practitioners, if that makes sense. I mean, we expect the same, and people say this all the time. We expect the same in other professions. We expect the same in medicine. We expect, my wife's a lawyer; she has to do CPD every year. The same is true in a lot of professions. So I think that, and no one likes that. No one likes having to do CPD. It's probably feels like a bit of a time waster, but I think it's important to be exposed to new ideas and have opportunities to engage in those sort of new ideas and practices.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I'm just wondering, Tim, what are some of the things that great schools do in terms of how to collect data? What are some of the systems in place that you've seen that some of the consistent things that really great schools do?
Look, I think it's about creating time. It's like everything in schools, isn't it? It's about time. It's not something that we do. It's something where time needs to be allocated to it. So I think that, to be using data effectively within a school, there needs to be, I suppose, well, for me, there needs to be that why. There needs to be that compelling why as to why we're looking at the data. What are we hoping will happen as a consequence of looking at the data? And once that is kind of clear and there's kind of a shared narrative around that, it's then about having, simple ways of collecting and aggregating the data. It's a bit boring, but it's like, if you want to bring your NAPLAN and your PAT data together with your internal data, how do you, what systems do you have to bring it together so people aren't playing in spreadsheets? That's what I used to do. 10 years ago, I was the person on the spreadsheets doing it. It was heaps of fun, but it's not very, not a very good use of a teacher's salary. And there then needs to be, I suppose, professional development around what the data means, what it doesn't mean, how it can be used. And then time for the teams together to work in, whatever you want to call them, professional learning communities, teacher learning communities, it doesn't matter, year level teams, to actually come together, look at the data, unpack what it means, and engage in that sort of, active inquiry. And I think until we actually make provision for that, until we make provision for teachers to have that time, I think it's very difficult for it to have a really sort of big impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important. I mean, time is one of those things which is an incredibly valuable resource in schools. And how would you suggest that we go about building that data literacy as educators, that ability to sort of understand how to use data more meaningfully in our classrooms?
Well, I mean, it's a tough one, isn't it? Because again, you kind of don't want to put all your teachers into one room at the one time and tell them, because there's a diverse range of points of readiness in terms of that journey. But what I've done for one school that I'm working with is I've sat down with them. I've helped them to design their analytics for teaching and learning package. So this is a high fee paying independent school, and I have a history with them, and I'm working with the school and with the third party that's building it, the analytics package. And alongside that, I've built an internal bespoke data literacy micro credential for teachers at the school. It's not very long; it's about an hour and a half, but it's really just about introducing them to some of the key concepts, key ideas of what the data is, what it means, what it can be used for, what it can't be used for, and that's been made available to the teachers. And what we've tried to do as well, though, is we've tried to cascade the leadership of that down. So it's not, and what I mean by that is it's about working with the principal, working with the heads of campus, working with the heads of school to understand what's there, what it can be used for. So they're aware of it. And so when they're talking with their teams, they're referencing it, and then supporting that mid-level. So the heads of faculty or heads of learning or whatever they're called in your school, to lead their teams. Because, the thing is, things don't work in schools without support from leadership. You can't just go, right, everyone, use data. You've got to sit down and say, what do we mean by data? Where does the data come from? How might it support you? And then again, it's about providing the time. I don't think, at least with a school that I'm working with at the moment, it's a 1 year journey. I think it's a 3 to 5 year journey. And that's it's probably, to be honest, it's probably longer than 3 to 5 years. But I think that's one of the things that we miss in schools. Like often we move from initiative to initiative every year because there's a new priority, or the department said we need to do this, or someone's seen a particular academic at a conference and they've gone, this is the best thing we could be working on. When in fact, kind of just like our governments, we kind of want them to sit down and go, this is what the long game is. This is what we're working on, and we're going to allocate a significant amount of time to it.
I think that's so important. I mean, you've talked obviously so much about the importance of having time and also space, and I think some of these things take a lot of time to initiate. And Tim, for those people that are not aware, what are some of the different types of data sets? I mean, we talk a lot in schools about sort of formative and summative data, and what are some of the advantages of collecting different types of these data sets within our classrooms, and how do we sort of do it practically?
Well, it's kind of interesting because so when I began my data journey back in 2007, for me, and maybe this speaks to the learning area and what I'd studied previously, I was really kind of fascinated by and into the standardized assessment data because it's more reliable, and depending on who you speak with, arguably more valid. But along the way, I kind of softened my stance on some of those things. And in fact, when I did my postgraduate work, it was kind of in the area of validity theory. And if this idea of what it means for an assessment to be valid kind of changed in the late 80s, early 90s. So, prior to that time, when the theorists talked about a test, so NAPLAN, for example, being valid, it was, does the test measure what it says that it will measure? And those sorts of things. And what happened over time is that really it moved towards, are the scores from the test appropriate for the sorts of uses that people are putting them to? So even now, when you look at certain testing websites and speak with teachers, people go, oh no, a test is valid if it measures what it says it will. And like it's an outdated way of thinking about it. And what I mean by is it's appropriate is it appropriate to use HSC scores or VCE scores or ATARs to measure the effectiveness of a school? And the answer to that will be, well, no. That's not what the score was designed for. Now, it's been designed for particular things, and I'm not an advocate either way. But the people that have designed it will argue that it's valid for what they want to use it for. The same with NAPLAN. NAPLAN was never really designed to provide accurate data at the student level. You just wouldn't trust it. You wouldn't. It's just if you look at some of Margaret Wu's stuff out of Melbourne Uni, this is from several years ago. It's got a margin of error of about plus or minus 12%, and that's the nature of the test at the class level. But once you start looking at the school level and the sector level, you start to get a bit more of a sense. It's much more valid at that level. The challenge that we have is that a lot of these scores, they start with one intended use, and then they end up being used by other people for things that are inappropriate, and it becomes invalid, if that makes sense. So anyway, I began my journey in standardized assessment, and I still love it, but I kind of drifted to begin to appreciate the other forms of data that we have access to. And I kind of referenced earlier, I'm much more interested in, classroom level data now. So I'm running some sessions for Independent Schools Victoria called understanding and using classroom data, and NAPLAN and PAT forms a part of that. But for me, if we want to have an impact on students and learning, the classroom is where it happens. When you look at NAPLAN, it's too late. When you look at VC and HSC results, it's too late. And those sorts of results are used to make systemic or school-based policy decisions. They can't influence the classroom. So I'm much more interested in the messy data that happens in the classroom. So whether it's you referenced formative before.
Yeah.
So what sorts of formative data are we using? And again, that doesn't need to be, it might be a test score. It might be a test that's been designed and delivered according to Patrick Griffin's approach to assessment for teaching with a rich developmental rubric, which I think, to be honest, that's what all of our assessments should be. But that's a massive change that needs to happen. But like it might be the observational data, it might be exit tickets, it might be mini whiteboards, it might be just the conversations you're having with kids or overhearing from kids in the classroom to get a sense for where they are and then adapting to it and responding to it. The key thing here is responding to the needs of students.
Yeah. So why do you think then we tend, and this is a generalization, of course, but why do you think schools then tend to lean towards that summative data assessments and those sort of broader NAPLAN PAT assessments when sort of it needs to be a combination of both? Why do we kind of lean the other way then if we know it's not particularly effective?
Because they're publicly available, and there are whilst we don't have league tables in this country, we have league tables in this country. The data is made available, and then the newspapers go to town on it. We've got websites like Better Education that scrape the various locations and put all this data up, and it's a lot hard. So one, I think it's easy to fixate and focus on these things. It's really easy to see that your ranking has gone up in the Better Education rankings from 50th to 20th or whatever it is without looking at what the data is. But also because it's a lot more complicated to focus on, say, growth measures, if that makes sense. Now, again, just looking at, we're just focused on, summative measures at the moment. Within the HSC, within the VC, within NAPLAN, there are these built-in, growth metrics or, value add metrics. But it's a lot more harder to explain to people what they mean, and you don't want to be the school that pulls the trigger on putting your value add data out there, because if this year you've got the top value add, it just means the school down the road is going to be publishing theirs next year, and I think that's counterproductive anyway. I think that it would just be it would be an arms race for kids being dropped out of schools, and it's, I suppose, to answer your question, it's just hard. It's much easier to focus on these key measures because that's what the departments are focusing on. That this funding, well, I don't suppose there's funding, but there's difficult conversations that are had about NAPLAN and PAT and HSC so that schools fixate on them because
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more, and I think it's easier to measure something like your PAT or your or NAPLAN or your or the Victorian equivalent, because it's just easier to see growth. But of course, that only measures a very specific component of a school system. I mean, I was told when I was at school that nothing really mattered until year 12, which I think is absolutely terrible advice, because it's and for me, it's really sort of got me thinking about how we measure the things that are really important. And for the teachers that are listening to this podcast, what are some things that we can do practically in our classrooms to help measure and to help capture what matters most in terms of data of our students? I mean, you mentioned mini whiteboards. One of the things that I do is I take photos of mini whiteboards all of the time to show progress. I also have exit slips. I set student learning goals. I have QR codes linked to Google Forms where students can tell me if I've been a good teacher or listen to them. We do well-being check-ins. But what are some other things that we can do to capture some of those things that are less concrete in the classroom?
I think you've kind of just highlighted a few good ones there, to be honest. I mean, for me, the first thing is, you've got to have a good sense of what it is you're trying to teach. So you've got to have a good intention of what the learning goals are. You need to actually be able to articulate those as learning intentions and success criteria for students. So without having and this is essentially, I'm channeling Dylan William and Harry Fletcher Wood there. So you need to know what it is you're trying to achieve. And then you need to be providing opportunities for your students to demonstrate mastery, whether that be as you've said, mini whiteboards throughout a class, whether it be exit tickets, entry tickets, whether it be, group discussions, where someone's building a mind map or a brainstorm on the class, and you're looking for ideas that students know. I like the idea of journaling over time, and you referenced before with the mini whiteboards taking photos over time. So looking for that change in terms of student understanding or manifestation of their understanding. I think that's really powerful. I'm a massive fan of student perceptions of teaching surveys, for gaining insights into the experience students are having in the class and how those experiences are changing. But yeah, like I think that, there's so many different things you can do, but I think that the first thing is, what are you trying to achieve? What are your success criteria? And this is probably, well, it's not more complicated or more work, but I'm a massive fan of Patrick Griffin's work on assessment for teaching. So, alongside of what do you want to do, how are you knowing how you're going to assess them? So you've got a rubric that isn't just for a task, it might be for a unit of work. So that you're actually, identifying where students need to be, and you're sharing that with your students so they can self-assess, that they can peer assess, and then you're kind of monitoring where they are in terms of that rubric as they progress.
Absolutely. I mean, we use sort of Seesaw and Google Classroom and all these different ways to break down the sort of perceived barriers between home and school. We set what we call WAGOLs, so what a good one looks like on the whiteboard and we on the smartboard, and we share that amongst all of our stages. And also, one of the things that I've been trialing in my class is obviously sort of writing rubrics, but student written writing rubrics, so that they're in the vocabulary of students. And that's been really wonderful, because when a student comes to me and says, I've finished, we can then go back to the success criteria and say, well, have you done, very simply, have you included a capital letter, a full stop, an adverb, or whatever that may be. But we found even like a platform like Seesaw is incredibly valuable. I know there's other platforms similar, but we get students to record their learning and upload videos, and then that creates a portfolio of work, which then gets sent home. And so I guess there probably needs to be a shift in sort of what constitutes good assessment and what is important. And one of the things that I'm trying to take my teachers through is an understanding with them that a great work sample is an amazing piece of an assessment. A student feedback survey is a great use of assessment. I mean, we've just started trialing, as I mentioned, QR codes linked to Google Forms where students rate how much they enjoyed the lesson from 1 to 10, and also if they learned anything. And can I be honest, after a student's been in trouble, their feedback is pretty brutal. But it's also, really interesting. So we've been trying to capture some of those, I guess, softer data points or less measurable data points.
I think it's one thing I will say this is everything's measurable. You just need to sit down and put the time, you need to identify what it is you're trying to measure. Now, it's not necessarily measurable in the same way. It might be around perceptions, measurement and tracking, but that's fine. I mean, end of year schools always do surveys, stakeholder engagement surveys, parent engagement surveys. I think they're really powerful things because, to be honest, I kind of see them as proxy anyway. So, schools, independent school, faith-based school, state-based school, we all have kind of the same goal, and that is to improve outcomes for students. Now, we might look at it through different lenses. It might be academic outcomes, it might be growth, it might be pathways, it might be well-being. Every school will have its own take on that, and that's fine. But the thing is, all of those things are measurable. In a way. It's about deciding how you want to measure it for your school, what's important for your school, and then what tools you're going to use to measure it, then acting on that data to do something. But in terms of, say, you referenced, because I referenced, I think, the idea of student perception surveys. I think they're really powerful because it's about a student's experience of the process. And the thing is, it's that process in the classroom that is what's going to impact on their learning. So without understanding how students are experiencing that, but not only how they're experiencing it, like a lot of tools out there, and they're from around the world, focus on, average scores. So if I look at, say, the the tripod survey from the US, they'll give you an average score on their 7 Cs. That's great. That's what the average is. But the average introduces the fact that there is variation in the classroom. So I've worked with some teachers to look at data from surveys where you're not just looking at what the average is, but the variation. And what you find is that in my class, for example, some kids, really, and I'm going to be very simplistic about this, are really having a great time in terms of their learning, but some kids are not having a great time. And it's not just that average score that's important, it's the variation in scores that's important. Because, we want to make sure as teachers, we are the adults in the room. We're the ones that are getting paid whatever the pay scale dictates we're getting paid. the kids aren't getting paid to be there. So we should be looking at some of this evidence for what's going on in the classroom and adapting what we do accordingly.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that's so important, and there's so much in there that we can unpack it. And but as we begin to kind of wrap up, because I do want to be respectful of your time, I did just want to ask you about. I mean, in New South Wales, we predominantly measure sort of A to E in terms of all of our key learning areas. Do you think that is a good way to measure student success, or what are some of the problems with that, or some of the benefits? Or
well, look, I mean, my question will be, what does an A mean? What does an A mean? What does a B mean? So
and
the thing is, none of those things, like, unless they're linked to something, unless they're linked again, and unless the A means something in terms of curriculum. So unless a B means something, a C means something. So if again, drawing on Patrick's work, Patrick's work is about building these, rich assessment rubrics where, yes, there are levels. He reverses his lettering because it's, about progression. And unless that A means something, so imagine, so you've picked up a group of kids and you're in year 9. It's the beginning of the year, you're brand new to the school, and you've got a good data system in place, maybe, and you can look at the class and go, these are the kids that got A's, these are the B's, these are the C's, these are the D's, these are the E's. What does that tell you?
Yeah.
Unless it's telling you something that's linked to what the kids' zone of proximal development is, it's kind of meaningless, and it's kind of a hangover from how we all went to school and then how our parents went to school and how their parents went to school. It's like percentages. I think that these things, percentage doesn't tell you anything other than on that particular piece of assessment, a student got this percentage of scores right and this percentage of scores wrong. So I think that, I'm not a massive fan. I understand why schools do them. Like, you can't just change them because, without a massive amount of re-education. But like I said, you need to link it to a rubric. It needs to it needs to be meaningful. I think back to what I said before about validity.
Absolutely.
It's like, how valid is an A?
Yeah.
If really, like, unless it has some sort of meaning that we can transition into use, it's not very useful.
Well, I found, sort of from my experience, that it sort of raises more questions than answers, and so a lot of parents, I mean, a C is sort of considered in New South Wales kind of exactly where you need to be, but I mean, it doesn't sound very good, does it?
Right.
And I think especially, I mean, it sounds as if an A is probably a good place to be, and so, like, I think for me, it causes a lot of confusion. I mean, but I love your idea of actually deciding, obviously, what the purpose of the data is and how to use it. It has to be useful, and you have to then use it to inform something. Like, there's no point in just measuring something and then moving on. So for me, for example, going back to this wellbeing data, I found out that 75% of my students really enjoyed a maths lesson, which is great, but 25% didn't. So we had to start to think about, okay, how are we going to make sure that more students are engaged? Yeah. And we did a perception survey where kids were, I said, do you see yourself as a mathematician? And 13% of our students said they did, and obviously sort of 87% did not. And so we really wanted to shift that perspective, and being able to measure before and after, and then talk about what it means to be someone which is engaged in maths was really wonderful. But my point to that very long story is, you actually need to do something with the data, otherwise it's just meaningless.
Which comes back to the questions you ask. Yeah. So, I do lots of survey design with and for schools, and you've got to, for me, it's about the questions you ask, and if it's going to yield actionable information. Because the thing is, if it's not going to yield actionable information, it's not worth doing. Like, schools are busy, teachers are busy. It's hard to run surveys. It takes time. I'd rather use no data than collect data that's not going to be very meaningful, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And just sort of in closing, Tim, what are some of the lessons that you think that we have learned through the sort of ongoing COVID-19 pandemic about how schools operate and how we measure kind of success at the school level?
So, like, not a hard question to answer. I think at least at the end of the first round of lockdowns, I mean, this has been going on for so long now, hasn't it? Yeah. We kind of learned that there wasn't that much learning loss. I haven't read anything in the last 12 months sort of around that, but I think what we've learned is that school can operate differently. I think that we've learned that we don't need to have the full days that we've had before. And then when you compare us to other countries as well, we have some of the longest school days, the longest school years, as compared to schools in the OECD. So I think that we've learned that, our approach to school can be different. I think, what it's brought to the fore is, well-being is important. although, but what we've also seen is, like I said, is this plethora of pulse checks that are out there.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious to see over time the impact that they're having on well-being within the schools, if that makes sense. Because I think it's critically important to measure the data, but we just need to make sure that we're acting based on it.
Yeah,
and actually that as schools, we're not, we're changing. So if we're going to collect some of this data, and sometimes I think the well-being data we collect is less well-being and more readiness to learn on a day-by-day basis. So if you're taking a pulse check daily, I don't know if it's well-being or more about giving you a set of the mind frame of the students as they come in, so you can adapt as needed. But I think that we've also learnt. No, like I think that's it. I think that, to be honest, in the background of all this, we've also got the discussion around ATAR and so forth, and learning profiles and that are going on. And I think that there is this sort of ongoing conversation that we need to get better at measuring things that are not more meaningful, but equally meaningful, and perhaps maybe more relevant. So I think that there's that kind of conversation happening as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, and I think you answered that question wonderfully, considering it was such a broad question. So thank you. Just in closing, Tim, what mark do you hope to leave in this data space with your work?
Oh gosh. Look, to be honest, I'll be happy if, when I engage with schools and when I engage with people, my goal is to not build ongoing work for myself. I want to leave people with, very quickly, feeling confident and capable to think about data differently. And to be honest, like in 3, 4, 5 years' time, I'd like there to be, many more people out there that have got a much bigger and greater skill set than I do, that I've helped to inform and sort of encourage in that direction. So, I essentially, if I can encourage schools and people to think about, like I said, doing data differently, and to think more broadly about purpose before they jump into the data, that would be awesome. If I can support schools to think about how they can transition from some of their, I do some work around developmental approaches to teaching and learning, to actually build more effective assessments that have greater levels of meaning, then I will be really sort of pleased. And if I encourage people to be thinking about their use of student perceptions of teaching data, then I'll be happy as well.
Amazing. Well, I think you're well on track to doing that. So thank you so much for your amazing work in this space. And finally, where can people find out more about you and stay in touch with your amazing work?
So I'm on LinkedIn at the moment. So if you Google, actually, I was about to say, if you Google Tim O'Leary, you'll find me, but you'll find about 1,000 of me.
Well, I can put all of this stuff in the show notes as well, so people can get in touch. But so LinkedIn is the best place to stay in touch.
Look, LinkedIn, my business's name is educationaldatatalks.com. You can Google my book, Classroom Vibe, Tim O'Leary. You'll pick that up. But LinkedIn is the best place to find me.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Tim O'Leary, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I'm so grateful that you would have a chat. Thank you.
No, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the Art of Teaching podcast today. I hope that you, like me, got some valuable insights out of our discussion. For show notes, please visit theartofteachingpodcast.com. I've one favour to ask. If you could please head to the iTunes page of the podcast and rate and review the episode. This would really help to get the interviews and resources to as many people as possible. Also, I've created a private Facebook group so that we can continue the discussion after each episode. The link is in the show notes. Thank you again for listening, and until next time.